So I just want to welcome everybody who is joining us today. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Mariame Kaba. I am a member of Survived and Punished New York. You will notice that I'm not on camera, and those of you who know me know why. It's because I hate being on camera. So you'll just have to deal with my disembodied voice floating mellifluously across the internet today. I'm really just so grateful to be joined by Monica Cosby, Kathy Boudin, Toussaint Losier, and Laura McTighe for today's event. I'm grateful to be supported by Hope Decter and Eve Couch from the Barnard Center for Research on Women, where I'm a researcher in residence since 2018 and for a few more weeks. Special thanks to Lauren Schechter, who is live captioning this event for us today. Want to make sure that people who need live captioning know that on the YouTube page, there's a link and you should be able to click on that link to access the captioning function. And we'll come back to that in a minute. I am going to offer some opening remarks to contextualize our discussion. Then our panelists are going to introduce themselves and offer their own contextual remarks, and that is going to be 5 to 6 minutes each. Then I'll be back to offer some more comments after they have spoken. And we're going to move on after that to a panelist discussion that I hope will be an engaged conversation where we kind of listen to each other and play off each other, even though there's some questions that I've sent ahead of time for people to consider. We're going to be joined later by Joss, a member of S&P New York, who will read some words written by an incarcerated person in the 1970s. And then we're going to come back for more discussion. We'll take some questions and we'll end the call with a call to action. So I'm really excited again for everyone who is joining us today and welcome you. So I'm going to open up by just starting off with some contextual remarks as to why it is that we are putting together or pulling together this event today. There are some slides that I have not made because I am technologically completely ridiculous. So I begged somebody to make these slides for me. So we'll see how it goes. You can move to the next slide for me, Hope. Thank you. So since the establishment of the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia in 1790, there have been countless prison and jail uprisings and riots and escapes and general resistance. According to Vernon Fox, there were at least 400 documented prison rebellions between 1855 and 1955. There were many more that were undocumented for sure. In 1857, a prisoner at Auburn Prison in New York was ordered into solitary confinement for refusing to work. 2 days later, 60 prisoners armed with hammers demanded and secured his release back into general population. In 1914, 700 prisoners at Blackwell's Island in New York rioted for the release from solitary of 40 other prisoners. In 1952, 50 prisoners at Trenton State Prison protested the failure of prison staff to provide medical attention to a prisoner. Next slide. Demands in these early rebellions focused on the brutality of guards, awful food, inadequate medical care, conservative parole board practices, and many, many other things. Between the late 1960s and the early 1980s, there were over 300 prison, quote, riots, or what I prefer to call uprisings and rebellions across the United States. the 1970s proved to be the most active era of prison uprisings and resistance in the United States. For people who are interested in getting more information about that era, I'll share later on a list of readings that are suggested and that you can follow up on. But Dan Berger's work is instructive and helpful. Vicki Law's work is instructive and helpful. Toussaint Losier's work is, instructive and helpful. Garrett Felber, George Jackson, just a whole bunch of folks who we can read. Joy James, who tell us a lot about that period of time, and even in the thing, help us think through the current moment as well. So the 1970s, as I mentioned, were a really important time for uprisings. And when people think of prison uprisings, one name stands above the rest, and that's Attica. Even people who know very little about jails and prisons will recognize the name Attica. From September 9th to the 13th, 1971, incarcerated people took control of the Attica Correctional Facility. They made a series of demands to prison administrators and held about 40 people as hostages. After 4 days of fruitless negotiations, Nelson Rockefeller ordered that the prison be retaken. 39 people were killed in a 15-minute assault by state police. The New York State Special Commission on Attica, appointed to investigate the uprising, suggested that, with the exception of Indian massacres in the late 19th century, the state police assault, which ended the 4-day prison uprising, was the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War. On September 9th, 1971, a declaration to the people of America was read by L.D. Barkley, a prisoner at Attica. Slide on this. And that some of the words from that statement. The people of the United States of America, first of all, we want it to be known that in the past, we have had some very, very treacherous experiences with the Department of Correction of New York State. They have promised us many things, and they are giving us nothing except more of what we've already got: brutalization and murder inside this penitentiary. We do not intend to allow ourselves to accept the situation again. Therefore, we have composed this declaration to the people of America to let them know exactly how we feel and what it is that they must do, and what we want primarily, not what someone else wants for us. We're talking about what we want. There seems to be a little misunderstanding about why this incident developed here at Attica, and this declaration here will explain the reason. Next slide. The entire incident that has erupted here at Attica is not a result of the dastardly bushwhacking of 2 prisoners September 8th, 1971, but of the unmitigated oppression wrought by the racist administrative network of this prison throughout the year. We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. The entire prison populace, that means each and every one of us here, have set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States. What has happened here is but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed. We will not compromise on any terms except those terms that are agreeable to us. We've called upon all the conscientious citizens of America to assist us in putting an end to the situation that threatens the lives of not only us, but of each and every one of you as well. We have set forth demands that will bring us closer to the reality of the demise of these prison institutions that serve no useful purpose to the people of America, but to those who would enslave and exploit the people of America. Last year, the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, under the current Trump administration, released a summary of its findings of the state of Alabama's prisons, for example. The accounts are stomach churning. The New York Times noted that one prisoner had been lying dead for so long that his face was flattened, while another was tied up and tortured for 2 days. A dive into the 53-page report reveals yet more horror. One prisoner was doused with bleach and beaten with a broken mop handle. Another was attacked with shaving cream so hot that it caused chemical burns, requiring treatment from an outside hospital. So conditions of confinement in the United States have been awful and continue to be awful. And yet incarcerated people and many of us on the outside continue to fight for people's freedom while also fighting for improved conditions for those behind the walls. Today's event will focus on what we can learn from prisoner resistance to their conditions of confinement in the past and present. We will talk about inside-outside solidarity. We will offer some calls to action for our current COVID-19 moment and more. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful, brilliant, committed panelists for this event. We are going to kick it off with Kathy Boudin, who will introduce herself and offer some contextual remarks. Kathy, welcome, and thanks for joining us today. You are on.
The current situation and to place it in a context. I know I'm supposed to just introduce myself briefly. So my name is Kathy Boudin. I became politically active in the 1960s, in which there were a multitude of movements: civil rights, Black liberation, anti-war, anti-imperialist women's movements, national liberation movements around the world. And it was a moment that in some ways is reflected in the present, in which many movements are happening simultaneously, each in their own lane, but connected by the whole system that gives rise to them. I was in prison for 22 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. And since returning home 15 years ago, I've been active in attempting to reveal the system of mass incarceration in the earlier years that I came home, and then be part of a movement to transform it. It's gone through different names, whether it's a carceral state, a prison industrial complex, a punishment paradigm, mass incarceration. And I think that the question is how to create a really different system that's truly about justice. And we know that that can't be done by just folks looking at criminal legal system, but really at the structure of the entire society. I've worked in healthcare and education. I'm currently co-director of the Center for Justice at Columbia University. Part of my work has focused on obviously trying to involve the entire university, students, faculty, in engaging in this issue, and also working closely with community that's been directly impacted by that. I'm also part of an organization called RAP, Release Aging People in Prison, in which we focus a lot on long-termers and the question of exclusion of people in prison who have been convicted for a violent offense, and why are they being excluded from criminal justice reform, and discussing that. And I'm part of a very large community of women, many of whom I was in prison with, many of whom I've met since I came home, that are working to change and take on the impact and understand how mass incarceration affects women, not just those who are in prison, those who are in the community, and the whole punishment paradigm affects women in many areas, whether it's welfare, whether it's foster care, whether it's child custody, all of those areas. I think that the context that I want to talk about is I think I have just tell me when I run out of my time. But I became, politically aware of prisons really in the 1960s and early 1970s, in which I saw the institution of prisons at that time really as an institution that punished political activists, people that were arrested in the civil rights demonstrations, the anti-war, Black liberation, the role of the consciousness of people who at that time were called third world, brown, Black, indigenous. Those movements framed and influenced the prison resistance that existed. Whether it's George Jackson or Wounded Knee or Panther 21, the context for much of prison activism, in addition to the rebellions that Mariame described, were about political education, about the world. And for me, it was beginning to understand prison as part of a broader state violence. I think it's important to know that at that time, our consciousness was so international that the poetry of Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the Vietnamese struggle, he wrote a poem: prisoners loosened from prison can build their country. From great misfortune arises true fidelity. The most troubled souls are the most virtuous. When the prison doors open, the real dragons emerge. So prison was not just about what was happening in this country. It was really an institution that people that were politically active, that were radicals, that were revolutionaries in every country ended up being in prison. And I think that to understand that each context in which we talk about prison is very different. The context of the present began around a consciousness of mass incarceration, but it wasn't necessarily international, and it wasn't just about people that were a part of political movements. I think that at this time, and it's partly the pandemic that's played a role in this, the understanding of the struggle about mass incarceration or the carceral state is increasingly tied to the much broader context of the struggle that we're dealing with in this country with a broader system. I don't know what we want to call it, whether we call it capitalism, imperialism, but the fact that at this time, healthcare, environmental issues, poverty and class, and clearly race, which goes through the entire thing, that the issue of mass incarceration is now tied in this country. And I think the pandemic has played a role to the broader system and to the broader movements. And I think that's part of our challenge right now, is how do we integrate that into the broader movements that are happening? And thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing everybody and to participating more.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Monica, you are up next. Thank you.
Okay. Everything Kathy said and everything everybody else is going to say. I think I try very hard not to say mass incarceration. Just, it seems to me that in the broad concept, it's always been this, right? We moved, it's just kind of one continuous change. To really go back to the beginning, it has always been segregation and isolation and all of this, right? And it's racism and it's misogyny, but it has always been, right? And so we moved from one institution to another institution to another institution, right? But it kept the same people confined in some kind of way, right? And so it kept people confined and segregated from each other and segregated in spots, right? So it's plantations and it's prisons and it's detentions in this. And so I think when COVID happened, because like there's a whole bunch of us that have already been doing this work, right? Some for the last few years, some for the last few decades, you know what I'm saying? And so we know that for real prisons are the pandemic, right? The reason that, well, I don't know, because I have a hard time with this one too, because I feel like on the one hand, we've been dying in the prisons. I was locked up for 20 years. We've been dying in the prisons because no healthcare, because by and large, there are people out here who think we deserve it, right? And I think that's like a huge part of the problem. We're having these discussions around like who let out of prison, violent versus non-violent offenders. Is this issue of punishment and deserving and who is seen as inherently criminal anyway, right? And so why would we let folks out of prison? I think that COVID is just killing us faster and more publicly, like for all the people that's been, because I don't understand how people didn't already know, right? It just seems weird to me that people didn't know that this was going to be a problem. But the only people that can look away are you're willing to look away, right? Like it's just remaining, it's willing to look away and leave you high. And because it's not just, it's everyone in the prison, it's the people that work in the prison too, right? They come and go out the prisons every day, you know? And so there's a reason that like, what is it, 7 or 8 of the 10 hotspots in the nation for COVID-19 right now are prisons, right? Why do we think this is? This is, I'm not even gonna go back to centuries. We can just say the past few decades, right? when this thing that we call mass incarceration really began to really truly fill up our prisons. So there was all this federal money, the 94 crime, a gazillion cuts in social spending, right? So people became more impoverished than we already were. Cuts to healthcare, mental health care, affordable, all of this happened at the same time, filled our prisons up even more and made them even more of death traps and kill boxes than they already were. Even though when all of this was happening, people were like, hey, don't do this bill, like it's gonna hit our communities hard, right? Like we knew, people knew, and they were warned, and it happened anyway, right? Because we deserved it, because of this. And it's more than just a punishment paradigm. It is a punishment paradigm, but it's a monster, right? Because it happens even in the ways that not just when we decide who gets out of prison, but once we are actually out of prison. Say someone's locked up for a violent crime, a murder, right? We get out of prison, we do our time, we're supposed to be able to get out and go on, right? And there's still like a gazillion barriers, right? And they're structural, but they're also interpersonal, because there are people that are like, well, I will hire this person, but I will not hire this person, right? So it's an infection. It's just as much a virus and an infection and a parasite as anything else. I will come back to this in a little bit. That's what I got. How do I mute?
Monica, you forgot to briefly introduce yourself. Did you say that?
I'm Monica Cosby. I'm Moms United Against Violence and Incarceration, Westside Justice Center, and I work with like a whole bunch of folks in and around and throughout Chicago, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. Now I'm muting myself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Toussaint, you are up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toussaint Losier, he, him pronouns. I'm based in Western Massachusetts, and I currently teach at UMass Amherst in the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies. And I just want to, first of all, say thank you to Mariame and for inviting me to be a part of this panel and really a part of this conversation. It's really what I'm looking forward to. And just want to say a little bit about just sort of my own experiences in terms of kind of what has brought me here today. Like almost a decade ago, in the aftermath of the last recession, I was in Chicago working with a bunch of different community organizations, including the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign, Southside Together Organizing for Power, a host of different groups that were really trying to deal with the on-the-ground issues that folks were facing. And one of the things that I thought that we found particularly inspiring was the kind of internationalism that Kathy was speaking about, in terms of folks being able to see how the struggles in neighborhoods on the south side and the west side of Chicago were linked to housing struggles, struggles for basic services, struggles against war and U.S. imperialism that were taking place in different parts of the world, but particularly in Latin America and in Africa, and the way in which that sense of how our struggles are connected has been really powerful. And I've really been trying to take up some of those lessons in some of the scholarship that I've done recently, a lot of it digging into how much, to a degree to what Kathy was speaking about, how much what we now refer to as mass incarceration, the ways in which many elements of it are linked to the Black freedom struggle that took place during the 60s and the 70s in particular, but also a lot of the struggles that took place in the prison. So a lot of the kind of scholarly work that I've been focused on has been trying to give us a better sense of understanding really how much the system that is sort of predicated and sort of frames itself as primarily preoccupied with issues of crime, issues of safety and so on, has built itself up to some degree in response to a lot of the movements that have taken place on the streets and behind bars. And Chicago and Illinois is really kind of a stunning example of that. And hopefully, really looking forward to the opportunity to share some lessons that have come out of that history. But one of the things that has also inspired me is the way that kind of contemporary examples of prison organizing with groups like Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, which is a network of prison organizers, many of them based in and around South Carolina, has been able to draw on a lot of that prison history, that movement history in terms of helping to mobilize organizing today. So for those of us who paid attention to and did our best to support the prison strike that took place in 2016, we'll remember that one of the ways in which that a prison strike was organized was done in such a way to explicitly coincide with really the period of time between the assassination of George Jackson in August of 1971 and the Attica Rebellion in September of that same year, and really tried to give an opportunity for prisoners to organize in a way that was connected to the history of struggle that's taking place behind bars in this country. And we've seen this also happen more recently when Jailhouse Lawyers Speak called for a prison strike in 2018, but in a way that was directly in response to a deadly riot that took place in Lee Correctional Center in South Carolina, and really trying to address the fact that as much as there might be moments of conflict between prisoners, that so much of that is connected to the conditions in which prisoners find themselves, and it's intentionally trying to kind of refocus our attention on really the inhumane conditions that exist behind bars. And I'm hoping that we can really use this conversation as an opportunity to kind of deepen our awareness of those conditions, those issues, and really use this as a moment in which to kind of galvanize a lot of the support efforts on the outside that can continue to support organizing on the inside. So looking forward to our time here together today.
Thank you so much, Toussaint. We're going to move on to Laura, last but not least.
Thank you so much, Mariame, and thank you to the Survived and Punished New York community. Thank you also to my co-panelists. I was smiling, Monica, when you were like, everything Kathy said and everything everyone else said. It's beautiful to be able to be in this conversation and thinking together in exactly the way that Mariame, you and Survived and Punished have opened up, and specifically in service of the organizing that you're doing in New York right now to be accelerating and intensifying pressure to get justice for our loved ones who are in lockup right now. So my name is Laura McTighe. I was born in Baltimore, but I've been raised in our country's movements to end AIDS in prisons. Currently, I'm on faculty at Florida State University, where I teach courses in prison abolitionist practice and decolonizing religion. I also am doing collaborative work inside of our county jail system with folks who are locked up, working with a new and burgeoning network called Queer Tallahassee, and also with a group of friends of mine who are trying to begin to get off the ground bail fund here in Tallahassee. One of the things in this moment that I've been doing is kind of going back to the files, back to the stories, back to the archives of the movements that raised me. The methods that I teach here in my classes at Florida State and the jails are the same ones that I learned from HIV prison activists more than 20 years ago. And they're the same ones that I work to develop in partnership with my beloved comrade, John Bell, over the course of our year on the ground, or course of our work on the ground in Philadelphia. So I joined ACT UP Philadelphia in 1999. And when I did, we were on the front lines, like many have said about the connections between incarceration and internationalism already. We were on the front lines of the global movement for HIV treatment access. And we were also fighting the same neoliberal order domestically at the nexus of healthcare and the carceral state. John was really at the helm of spearheading work to organize residents of the city's latticework of informal recovery houses to take action at these intersections. He'd been in Philly at this point for about 2 years, having barely made it out of Baltimore, deep in a heroin addiction, and being literally brought back to life with triple combination therapy. Over the next 2 years, he and I worked to build Teach Outside. It was a community organizing program for formerly incarcerated people living with HIV. Several of our first graduates joined ACT UP and traveled with us up and down gatherings along the East Coast, including the Critical Resistance East Conference in 2001. But it was that same year and work that was happening and crisis happening in the jails in Philly that really firmly rooted us in what Andrew James has been pushing us on, a hyper-local focus to build together the community that we need to be able to take on mass criminalization in our communities, in our country, and in our world. That year, several people died from medical neglect in the Philadelphia jails while they were awaiting trial. And I want to emphasize something that all of my co-panelists have already said and that Mariame's remarks underscored from the first demands that were being issued by in-prison strikes. Prisons are no places to be sick. They are no places to be, period. Our protests on the ground were swift. We were taking over both the streets and the office of the managing director who oversaw the prison healthcare contract at that time with Prison Health Services. City council hearings followed. Ultimately, the city responded by putting in place a new commissioner with a mandate to fix healthcare in the jails. We knew, however, as all of us do, that a prison can't oversee itself. And so from ACT UP, we joined forces with mental health advocates, others citywide, to try to form a prison healthcare coalition. As part of that coalition's work, we devised a grassroots strategy of checks and balances. So whatever issues were unfolding inside, and we knew that family members would hear them first. And the question was, how do we connect with people? So part of our outreach work was going literally to the only bus that you could take in order to get to the city jails and sitting there with people. The bus came every 30 minutes and we would just sit and talk. And it was literally a work to try to expand in a place where the average the average time that you would stay inside was for 2 days, to continually expand and expand and expand and expand the network. We began by trying to reach family members, and a huge part of who we started connecting and bringing in were also people who had just gotten released and were on their way back up, sometimes to get their property if they had gotten released in court. That was how I met my dear friend and comrade, Wahida Shabazel, who's one of the co-founders of Positive Women's Network USA. She joined our Teach Outside class in 2003 and found kindred spirits, both with people who were in her class and folks beyond. And that really shifted this kind of ongoing engine of work to hold the jails accountable and also build pathways from coming home. Wahida, Trish, Brian, LaDonna, Teresa, so many folks I've had the privilege of being in partnership with wanted to bring reckoning to the jails that they had been incarcerated in. And they figured out they were pioneering ways of sharing stories through our national prison health news readership. They were raging over bullhorns outside of the house of the New Jersey judge who had refused to grant compassionate release to our incarcerated ACT UP comrade, Gregory Smith. And they worked to expand what had just been bus stop outreach into a formerly incarcerated-led watchdog group and official visitors program inside the Philly jails. And I want to offer this as a sort of concluding nugget of this story, particularly thinking about the type of work that you all are escalating in New York. The prison commissioner said repeatedly that he agreed to meet with us and took action on our demands because he did not want us to show up at his house too. I want to pause there and take a moment to zoom out as I pass the baton back over to Mariame, and then she moves us into conversation, just to think about what lessons that small window provides for our contemporary moment. I think that whenever we tell stories, there are lots of stories that we can tell about the stated intents of the criminal legal system. But what we know and what's already been underscored by Kathy, by Monica, by Toussaint, is that prisons have been built through the disassemblage of entire communities, and that is what their purpose is. So one of the lessons that I've learned from AIDS activists is that we've long refused to let the HIV community be sliced and diced along any of the axes of innocence or guilt, and we've insisted on a unified community across prison walls of people living with HIV. And so I I've seen so many ways that those lessons have been carrying forward. And I believe that all of us that are fighting to get our families out of lockups today are walking strongly in that legacy. That means that we are already organizing as if prisons don't exist. And I don't mean that in a naive way. I say as if, because in our relationships and in the truths that we make together, they already do not. As organizers, we hold the possibility of the horizon of possibility in our hands. And that possibility is the possibility of making the world otherwise. So I'd like to close with words that have been my sort of watchwords from my dear comrade, John Bell. We don't accept precedent, we set precedent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for those comments, and everybody for your very just incisive, important comments. Can't wait to hear more from you. Hope if you can just put up the next slides. I want to kind of ground us in, we've been talking a little bit about the history of things. You can get to the next slide after this one, to the histories that are so important. And so we want to talk a little bit about some of the demands that have been put forth by incarcerated people in the past, in order to talk about demands that we're raising up in the current moment, so that we understand what that is and where we're coming from around that. So just want to share the manifestos, and there have been manifestos and prisoner bills of rights and strike demands that have been issued by incarcerated people everywhere for generations. For example, in August of 1970, incarcerated people at the Tombs in New York protested food that was, quote, not fit for human consumption, while making demands centered on, quote, injustice we suffer in the courtrooms of the criminal court and the Supreme Court of Manhattan County. Weeks before the Attica uprising, on July 2nd, 1971, the Attica Liberation Faction, a group of incarcerated people at the prison, drafted a list of demands that were presented to Commissioner of Corrections Russell Oswald and Governor Nelson Rockefeller. There were 27 demands, and those demands were inspired by a list of demands that had already been formulated the year before, in November of 1970, by striking prisoners at Folsom Prison in California. For those of you who are interested in more of that history, it's a great thing to take the Folsom Prison demands for their strike and look at the Attica Liberation Faction's demands to see where there are continuities and where there were breaks. I'm just going to uplift a few of the demands that were made. We demand a change in medical staff and medical policy and procedure. The Attica Prison Hospital is totally inadequate, understaffed, and prejudiced in the treatment of inmates. There are numerous, quote, mistakes made many times, improper and erroneous medication that is given by untrained personnel. We also demand periodical checkups on all prisoners and sufficient licensed practitioners 24 hours a day instead of inmates' help that is used at this point now. There are also other demands that I mentioned there are 27. There are a few other ones that I just want to lift up for us. We demand adequate visiting conditions and facilities for the inmate and families of Attica prisoners. The visiting facilities at the prison are such as to preclude adequate visiting for inmates and their families. Another one, we demand that inmates be granted the right to join or form labor unions. We demand that all institutions using inmate labor be made to conform with the state and federal minimum wage laws. We demand an end to escalating practice of physical brutality being perpetrated upon inmates of New York State prisons. We demand an end to the discrimination against prisoners when they appear before the parole board. And then again, it's longer than that. We demand that better food be served to the inmates. The food is a gastronomical disaster. We also demand that drinking water be put on each table and that each inmate be allowed to take as much food as he wants and as much bread as he wants, instead of the severely limited portions and the limited slices of bread. It goes on. In conclusion, we are firm in our resolve and we demand as human beings the dignity and justice that is due to us by our right of birth. We do not know how the present system of brutality and dehumanization and injustice has been allowed to be perpetrated in this day of enlightenment, but we are the living proof of its existence and we cannot allow it to continue. The taxpayers who just happen to be our mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, daughters, and sons should be made aware of how their tax dollars are being spent to deny their sons, brothers, fathers, and uncles of justice, equality, and dignity. So Survived and Punished New York, as I mentioned earlier, which I'm a member, has been hearing from our inside comrades and inside members over the last few weeks as COVID has been ravaging the country and the world, that there are many things happening on the inside that while they have continuity, as Monica mentioned before, there are things that have always occurred, have an increased sense of precarity, of urgency, of kind of, increased danger in this current COVID moment. And they wanted us to share some of the demands that they have of particularly our folks who were at Bedford Hills prison in New York. So we created, based on what we've heard, a set of demands we've been articulating and pushing the administration of Bedford Hills, as well as the governor, as well as the head of the DOC, to make sure that they actually attend to these and that they, give in to these demands. We're saying all incarcerated people should be allowed to protect themselves against possible COVID-19 infection without punishment. This includes, but is not limited to, being able to cover their faces with masks, fabrics, or their hands. Consistent self-determined opportunities to shower and wash hands with soap, reducing the risk of contracting the virus. No one should be forced to work with civilians from the out or people from the outside as long as the COVID-19 epidemic is happening, i.e. in the DMV, etc. This must not be used then as an excuse to shut down the commissary, package room, or any other facility that serves incarcerated people. For the state needs to provide at no cost non-coercive testing, soap, CDC recommended hand sanitizers, tissues, and hygiene items to all incarcerated people. Incarcerated people must have accessible communication with loved ones. Keep all mail and communication lines open. All facility phones should be functional. All phone calls should be free. People should be provided with unlimited emails through JPay. How about extended access to also video conferencing? Paper mail must be delivered in a timely manner. Keep commissary and package rooms open so people can get what they need. Items sold at commissary and packages sent into prison are solely for those who are incarcerated. Our comrades inside have always pushed back against the confiscation, hoarding, outright theft of these items at the hands of COs. Now, during this crisis, it is imperative that what is sent to them go immediately to them. Furthermore, the price gouging of commissary items must stop. To this end, any fines or fees associated with accessing commissary funds must be canceled so all funds are accessible in their entirety. Any money earned or put on the books of an incarcerated person should be immediately accessible to spend at commissary, no garnishing of funds. We demand transparency and open information sharing about the prison, from the prison, about what their current policies are regarding COVID-19 and what they are doing for, quote, treatment. No punishment for folks who test positive. This includes the use of inhumane isolation tactics like solitary confinement. Incarcerated people should be provided accurate medical information about COVID-19, including what symptoms are. So you can just see that, a lot of the calls for humane treatment, for an ability to be able to, access decent healthcare while you're in a pandemic, the ability to keep connections with your loved ones. All of these are consistent from the demands that have always existed. But now there's a particular urgency to these demands. We are also hearing from our comrades inside that folks are being denied food, are being given breakfast half cups of some weird, oatmeal, and that's it for the rest until some horrible lunch later on in the day. Right now, we're very much pushing against the starvation that folks say that they are experiencing on the inside at Bedford Hills. So I'll be back later to talk about more specific calls to action of how you can help us put pressure on the prison to address the demands and the needs of the folks on the inside. But I want to move us over now to the second part of our third part of our time together, which is a conversation that we're just going to have with all the panelists. So I'm going to make sure that everybody can see and unmute yourselves when needed. All right, we're going to kind of start with 2 questions. And then anybody who wants to jump in, feel free. So the questions on the table are, what did it mean for incarcerated people to resist the conditions of their confinement historically? What are some of the current ways that incarcerated people are resisting the conditions of their confinement? So those are the 2 questions on the table, but I would just open it up to anybody to share what's on your mind in this moment, either things that might have been, sparked by hearing the other folks who've talked so far, or things that you've had on your mind. So let's jump in. Whoever wants to go first. Kathy, want to get us going?
Me?
Yep.
Oh. Okay. I don't know, in terms of the question that you asked about the past resistance, I want to add, I think that the resistance in the past involves, of course, the uprisings that you've described. I think that the demands, the manifestos are really important to name, and I'm actually very excited about what you've put together. I also think that resistance can be about building community inside, building programs inside, building families inside. There's a survival. It can be defined more passively as survival, but I think survival is also a form of resistance. And in the experience that I had at Bedford Hills, and also in my knowledge about things that have happened in other New York State prisons, there were things that we did inside to build, to cope with. The AIDS epidemic is maybe the first one that I dealt with, because I had just gotten to Bedford Hills at that time and the epidemic was taking off. But we knew that simply that doctors couldn't help what we were dealing with, that counselors could not deal what we were dealing with. 1 out of 5 women coming into the New York State system in 1989 were HIV positive, 1 out of 5. And the level of stigma and fear, ignorance about what to do. There was no cure at that time. People were just dying. And the only solution was for us as people that were incarcerated to educate ourselves, to get help being educated, and to begin to teach ourselves, to begin to care for the people that were dying, to begin to prepare people to go home and have safe sex or safe use of drugs, and to build a sense of community inside. And it took several years to do it. But that community inside ultimately ended up saving lives, caring for people who were dying, ultimately doing a walkathon to raise money, that we got money from the guards as well as from families that we could then give to people that needed it. And I think that's a form of resistance. It didn't involve an uprising, but it did involve the resistance to what was killing us and destroying us. Similarly, when college was eliminated, it was devastating to have higher education eliminated in the 1994, Omnibus Crime Act, because college gave people a way of changing their lives and of re-entering society with something that could help them create a new path. And as women inside, we said, we have to bring college back. We have to figure out how to do it. And through collaboration with people in the community, we obviously had the permission from the superintendent, the warden of the prison, to work on this. we actually were able to build a new model that was a privately funded college that came from Marymount College, and then it was a consortium and many colleges participated, but it was the drive of those of us inside that said, we have to figure out a way to bring higher education back. So I think that understanding that part of resistance is figuring out how do you survive and make things happen. And obviously it depends on who is the superintendent, who is the warden, how much you can do in that way. But certainly if you look at the history in New York State, you look at like what Eddie Ellis was able to do and create a research project, a think tank inside of Greenhaven Prison, and do an analysis that 5 boroughs of New York City were actually bringing it was from those 5 boroughs that most of the people ended up in prison. That kind of a think tank that could connect coming to prison with poverty, with the conditions in the neighborhood, that came out of the work that people did inside the prison. So I want to define that as well as a form of resistance. There's much more to talk about. There's more stories, but I just want to start with that.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I love that you've uplifted those just daily individual kind of, and community within on the inside models of resistance as well. That's terrific. Monica, do you want to jump in? And I don't know if somebody's still on the call, a line that you wanted to share as well.
Hey, so I just got off the phone with my sister, friend, comrade, wife, who's locked up in Decatur right now. She says hi, and she just I was like, is there anything specific you want me to say to anyone? She was like, there is nothing I'm going to say any different than what you probably already said. So, and I feel like she still should have said something. She was like, go do your I miss her so much. I'm afraid for her and everyone that I left. Okay, this is what I'm gonna say. Kathy, thank you so much for everything that you just said about us building our communities that we have inside. So this journal, I got this as a birthday gift from a young woman. She was 17 when she got locked up, and and her name just happens to start with an M, and she said it looked old fashioned, and she, like I was, I don't know, not like really a mother hen, more like a mother bear, but so she was like, I'm old, so I should have this. So she gave this to me, and I wrote in this on the day that I got out of prison. 11 December 2015, Friday morning. I got out of prison today. Alan, this is Alan Mills from Uptown People's Law Center. Alan came to pick me up. We stopped at a Walmart. I'm wearing a loud pink shirt, jeans. I still have no sense of fashion. And I go on to say that I still got on my Shorty Bang shoes. Shorty Bang is a young, I was locked up with Shorty Bang all the way from Dwight, from back in the day, all the way to Logan. When they shut down Dwight and they shut down Lincoln, they transferred all of us in Illinois, all the women, to Logan, right? And so we got to see each other after like, several years where we didn't get to see each other. We don't get to communicate like from joint to joint, from prison to prison. We don't get to do that, right? And so I got to see her, we'd go hang out in the yard and stuff like that. Her name was Veronica, right? We all called her Shorty Bang. Shorty Bang has struggled with a lot of issues, right? In the summer of 2015, shortly before I got out of prison, she killed herself. And I don't even like to say it like that. I feel like and I put the shit in a poem, IDOC murdered her by suicide. That's what the fuck happened. Oh, I probably shouldn't be cussing on the live stuff.
You can cuss, it's okay.
We had asked the warden, and because like generally speaking, we don't really ask permission, we just be doing shit. We asked the warden for permission, and the warden at the time was, how Kathy, you said like so much depends on who the warden is, because I'm gonna come back to this point too in a second. So we got this one warden who's like, I'm the warden and I want everyone to know. So she sent the TAC team in like, I don't know, 4 times in 1 month, just all this ridiculous stuff. And during the time that Shorty Bang was killed, there were several suicides and suicide attempts, right? And so we had asked, to have a memorial service for her. She was one of the long timers, right? And so they were like, no. We were like, okay, because we're gonna do one any fucking way. And I sometimes fear talking about some things out here because the people that I'm still the closest to are still there, right? And they can be retaliated against. And we do get retaliated against, right? So after they said no, it was a little back and forth. So the administration decided to let us have a memorial service for everyone, but they wouldn't let us say anyone's name, anyone's. So we was like, okay, so we went to that little one that they let us have in the gym, and it was nice and everything, you know what I'm saying? But this is not what we asked for, And so in Illinois prison, state issues are blue and white. So you have gray jogging suits, white t-shirts, white polos, and blue pants. That's your state issues. There's no other color. Everything is blue and white and gray. Shorty Bang's favorite color was purple. And so somebody sent out a little small kite, and somebody maybe got access to a copier, right? And we just had a plan. We were going to have a memorial service. So coming up to memorialize her, everybody wore something purple. So we got a hold of purple Sharpies, purple paint, whatever, anything we could get a hold of that was purple. We made something purple. We had on purple eyeshadow. We found a way to make purple nail polish. We dyed our t-shirts purple out of stuff. And I put Shorty Bang and some flowers and all kinds of stuff all over my shoes, right? I'd gotten hold of a fabric marker, right? And I just had purple, like we had purple. We just purpled up for the day so that wherever Shorty was, she could see us and know that we gave a fuck, right? To remember her. And I don't know whose idea that was to do that, It just, the people that were the closest to her wanted to remember her. And that's resistance, right? It's, love is contraband in hell, and we do it all the time, right? It is the ways that, I've talked about this before, the ways that we make art for each other as gifts. It is the ways when there's a woman that's locked up in Illinois. Well, there's a whole bunch. She's a long time, she's been locked up like 40 years. This woman, she has, from the entire time that I met her in the 90s when I first got to the joint after leaving Cook County, she has worked with the women on the MHU, which is the mental health unit. She has worked with women that the prison deemed so unhelpable, right, that they kept them in MHU seg isolation, right, MHU isolation cells, right? She's worked with women to the degree that they came out of isolation. Roughly about half the time they went back to GP, right? They went back into general popper. They were able to at least come out of isolation and have some semblance of, I don't want to say normalcy, but they weren't in isolation anymore, right? She has worked with thousands and thousands of young people, and just people, period, come through the joint to get their GEDs, go home and stay home. That's love, that's resistance, when we take care of each other in the ways that we can, right? And that's it. That's resistance all day long. It doesn't maybe look like organizing, but it's making sure that, and I know my girl down the hall gonna trip if she ain't got no coffee, so I'm not gonna hoard the 2 jars of instant folders I got in my lockbox. I'm gonna make sure she got some coffee. You know what I'm saying? It's those kinds of things. That's resistance all day long too. It is surviving and helping each other survive while still trying to make some shit happen.
Thank you so much, Monica. Yes, thank you. Anybody else? Laura, Toussaint, do you all want to jump in?
Yeah, I really want to add to as much as I can what was said earlier. What's the phrase that we have going now? Everything that Monica and Kathy have said, and then some. I want to suggest that in addition to the really essential work of building community and really family behind bars, and the way in which that serves as a form of really powerful resistance and kind of essential work, that some of the types of protests and prison takeovers that Mariame sort of started the conversation out, kind of giving us a history of. Part of what they do is they sort of explode the contradiction of prison. And prison sort of predicates itself on being like a near total institution, like one that has control in all these different ways. And forms of resistance, especially overt resistance, demonstrate the way in which that sense of control, how fragile it is. And part of what it does is also provide an opportunity for the public, which is supposed to be not really intervening or paying attention to this sort of closed off institution that's sort of out of the sort of general purview. It really opens things up and provides an opportunity, really supposed to force the general public to pay attention to what's happening behind bars. And I think that's one of the things that sort of we've seen happen over and over again with this sort of history that Mariame laid out, is that it forces the rest of society, quote unquote, to pay attention, or at least cast at least a temporary glance to the conditions that exist behind bars, and potentially reckon with them. And it also forces those who are supposed to be running institutions to kind of contend with actually the limits of their power. And we see that in the history that Mariame laid out, even in the ways in which, for instance, one of the things that we don't often get told in terms of how the criminal justice system has changed is in the aftermath of Attica. One of the things that we do see happen is that demand that existed in Attica for improvements to conditions. There were some changes that came in response, potentially largely out of a fear that other prisons that had conditions that were as bad as Attica or potentially worse were going to end up with similar sorts of revolts. There were actually similar, there were instances where conditions were at least improved slightly. And also instances where you have prisoners organizing labor unions. So organizing actual organizations that are predicated on providing opportunities for prisoners to bargain and really have some control over their working conditions. And that was actually a strategy that some prison organizers tried to push forward in terms of saying, if we can build labor unions behind bars, if we can get kind of some legal recognition, that provides us an opportunity to collectively bargain over the way in which prisons operate. And one of the most striking examples that I've been made aware of by a former mentor of mine, Jamie Bissonnette, is a prison rebellion that took place here in Massachusetts in 1973, where in response essentially to an illegal guard strike, where the guards carried out a wildcat strike and walked off the job, prisoners and their outside supporters were left running the institution for weeks. And it actually ended up in a situation where the prison guards attempted to sort of frustrate reform efforts that were being carried out by the administration and undermine prison organizing efforts, and attempted to sort of kind of leave the institution in the hands of prisoners and their outside supporters as a way to demonstrate really how inherently bad prisoners were. And actually one of the things that ended up emerging out of that circumstance was prisoners themselves actually being able to run the institution and run it better than the administrators themselves, and really demonstrate how unnecessary the institution was in the first place, right? If you could have prisoners running the institution, that really demonstrated how these were people who really didn't need to be kept behind bars in the first place. And that was crushed, it was undermined, but it demonstrated in many ways how much the illusion of incarceration and really the sort of the kind of attempt to kind of put forward a sense of having total control over everything that was happening behind bars, how fragile that was. And that's one of the ways in which efforts to demand even modest improvements, or what might be seen as like reasonable improvements to conditions behind bars, are ignored or resisted or repressed so vigorously because of the way in which those kind of demands really push up against the way in which prisons kind of purport to act and operate in the first place.
Yes, jump in.
Thank you so much for that, Toussaint. And yeah, to continue and echo the mantra, thank you, everything Monica said, everything Kathy said, everything Toussaint said. I've been thinking, and actually Mariame, when you sent us these questions, what came to mind for me was, were so many of the stories that I've learned from and from people I've been mentored by that fall exactly with where Kathy kicked us off. And I think there's a way that I kind of hear that thread stitching across each of the pieces that my fellow co-panelists have been offering thus far. I began in the remarks that I offer by telling a story, because I think stories are how we get free. They're how we understand ourselves. They're how we feel our connections. And I felt that so deeply, Monica, as you were sharing, like, what does it mean to be able to actually have the right to mourn, to be able to honor somebody that you love, and to be in an institution that literally is taking that possibility away from you? Like, that level of life and death is what we're talking about. And that's what I've learned from folks who are still inside, folks who have come out and are organized me on the outside, that this system, we have to drill down literally into the violence of how the system tries to make human relationships impossible. And when we understand that truth, that's what everything moves from. That every single thing that we're talking about of resist and build together as one, it's exploding an understanding of what resistance is. Because what we're moving by is understanding that the system is trying to tear us down to our core. And that every single thing that we do that is about cementing and extending relationships is pushing at the very thing that makes this run. One of the stories that I like, it's a story that I teach in my classes, and it's a story that was like the kind of the impetus for the coursework that I've been doing in partnership with folks in the county jails here. That's the big question, what's really going on? We kept talking about how we were like, okay, we're building the car while driving it. We're trying to figure out how to pull another layer back, pull another layer back, pull another layer back. And one of the stories that really did that for me was the Laura Whitehorn story, and when she was in the Baltimore County jails, that opens Vicki Law's book. And it's the first time that I heard her tell it in person. She described it as the second most radical action she had ever been a part of. And for people who haven't read Vicki's book, haven't seen the story, I'll give a brief bit that you should get it from Laura's words, because she's the actual person to get it from. That she was talking about coming in, and there was this coming in around the winter holidays, around Thanksgiving and leading up to Christmas. And that there had been a promise made to people that there was going to be this amazing Thanksgiving dinner. And folks, everyone in the county jails were going to get big turkey dinner. And when the turkey dinner came out, the turkey legs were as hard, like you could use them to crack the cinder blocks on the walls. And it was just this moment of complete falling down. And Laura describes herself in that moment. She's like, yeah, I was a hothead. Like, I was like, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do that. And folks were like, and this underscores the point that Kathy and Monica put out for us. Like, you need to know the administration and know exactly how you move under that radar, or else you're going to end up doing so much, and so much damage to yourself. And if the goal is figure out how to refuse the system taking our connections and taking our life, but whatever thing is that does that is what resistance looks like. And so Laura Whitehorn describes herself getting quiet and listening to all the folks that she was locked up with, and folks started stockpiling everything that they could get from commissary for the next month. As the jail said, oh, we're sorry, this was really bad, but we're gonna make it up to you on Christmas. And then Christmas came, and there were knocks, kind of doors open, here's Christmas dinner, and no one came out of their cells. And everybody had already stockpiled stuff and had their own feast that they were sharing. And it was literally a moment that she described in concert with the folks that she was in the Baltimore jails. It was like you could feel everything fall apart in that system. because it was a moment when everyone who was standing in solidarity with one another showed you literally can't do the thing that the system is designed to do. So I'd offer that up in thinking about like what it feels like, what it means to stitch the stories together that we're doing, how working under the leadership of people who are currently incarcerated and have been incarcerated actually like explodes our understanding of what resistance could be. And that's where we get the kernels of how we build abolition in every single thing that we do.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have anything that you want to respond to? And then we're going to take a short little interlude where Joss is going to read some words from an incarcerated person from the 1970s. Anything that anybody wants to jump in on? Okay, we're going to interlude and then we're going to come back and keep talking. Joss, you are on, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to participate. Okay. I'm going to read an excerpt from a statement by an incarcerated person named Ahmed Al-Aswadu, who wrote this in the April-May 1971 issue of The Black Scholar. The Hole, called such because its locality is usually under the prison's first floor, is solitary confinement. One could stay in the hole for a week or a lifetime, depending upon his color and attitude. It is here in the hole that men are made and broken at the same time. It is here that the previous threat of getting hurt can realize itself all too quickly. And it is here that the seeds of Black consciousness have been cultivated in the minds of many Black men. It is very difficult for a layman such as I to describe the atmosphere of the hole, but I shall try. I believe that the very first thing that the brother notices about the hole is the desolateness and the feeling of utter aloneness. The first time that I was sent to the hole, I felt as if my soul had deserted me. I don't believe that I had ever experienced such a feeling of intense emptiness in my life before then. I had been sent to the hole to have my attitude changed because, as they stated, it was not conducive to good order. A brother had just been murdered by the guards who worked in the hole. And rather than go through that type of thing, I pretended to be institutionalized. Fortunately, my stay only lasted 14 days, and I was returned to the general inmate population. Life in the hole is epitomized by one big question mark. Uncertainty is the order of the day. Your visitors are turned around at the gate when they come to see you. The food quantity and quality is drastically reduced to the level of subsistence. You might get a shower, and you might not, depending upon whether the guard's wife was good to him the night before. I believe that it is the hole that is the most memorable aspect of the prison experience. They are all the same, and yet they are totally different from one another.
Thank you so much, Joss, for sharing those words. I wanted to kind of uplift those words in part because currently here in New York State, HALT Solitary, HALT Solitary, is pushing to both the governor and the head of the Senate and the Assembly to pass legislation banning solitary confinement in New York State prisons. They've been doing a whole series of actions all week and the week before, both in-person actions and virtual actions, calling for the end of solitary in New York State. And I think one of the kind of, to me, one of the prisons are about isolation, in large part, cutting people's ties from the outside, cutting people's ties from each other, even though folks, fight really hard and resist to build community despite that. But they are also intended to make us kind of to disappear people from us. And solitary confinement It's one of the most, it is by the United Nations standards, a form of torture. It's a form of torture, period. People I know who've been locked up and have been in solitary, many have had just incredibly difficult mental health issues. If they didn't have them before, they definitely had them when they came out. And I just wanted to uplift that we, at the very least, in New York, they ought to be banning solitary confinement. I mean, this is like how this is not something that's so basic, and how we're still trying to address this, to me, is just a sign of how repressive prisons and jails are, and how much we have to be constantly uplifting the voices of folks on the inside who let us know what that experience can feel like for somebody. And if Ahmad al-Swadu was writing that in 1971, it could be written today in the same way by other people who are currently experiencing that form of torture. So I just wanted to bring in more voices. I wanted to tie the past to the current moment and the fights of the current moment through that. And I hope that folks will look at what Halt Solitary is trying to do in New York, follow their work. I'll make sure I tweet out more about their campaign soon, so that more people can sign on and help fight that fight. So want to get back to our panelists as we get towards the end of this. We have about 30 more minutes, and I want to take this time to ask us to reflect on a couple of other questions, if possible, and along with whatever you want to share from the previous questions. Those questions I have on the table right now is, how have and do people on the outside demonstrate solidarity with people on the inside? What are the challenges? What are the things that you think work and don't work? And people have been contending that jails and prisons are a pandemic. I guess we should maybe uplift what you all think that means. Is there something unique about COVID-19 and its impacts on carceral institutions compared to what always is? So if anybody wants to address one or both of these questions, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Please jump in without me calling on you, though.
I don't know. I've had the benefit of you calling on me twice to open it up. I don't know. Can I do that again, or does somebody else have to go?
Yes, feel free.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the issue of demonstrating solidarity. And, there's so many people that I would like to mention and to talk about, and I sort of haven't, but I'm glad, Monica, that you have talked about people in particular, and actually each of you have. But going back to the previous thing, I agree, Laura, that the system wants to destroy relationships, but I want to start with the fact that I think the system wants to destroy people. And I think both things matter, because I think that, I think this is something you've said, Toussaint. Essentially, they see people in prison as not human beings, and they're happy to do as much destructiveness as they can. And I think in that sense, our ability inside to be people that create, that can build community, can have relationships, it is an assertion of a humanity that they do not want to acknowledge, and they do everything they can to destroy. And although many people have emerged from prison being very strong and educated and leaders on the outside, and people say, yeah, I grew in prison, this happened to me in prison, it's because other people in prison were able to help them. It was the people in prison that designed the programs that made a difference for their lives. And it wasn't the prison establishment, because the contradiction is so great in the desire to define people as less than human that those programs can't work in the same way, unless it's people who are our peers that actually are able to acknowledge the humanity in each of us. I think the other thing is that I want to say is that many of the things that I described in the work that we were able to do at Bedford, or the work that's happened throughout the prison system in New York, when I mentioned Eddie Ellis, and I can mention many other people, that work is done often by people who are in prison for violent crimes. And I think that one of the critical things that people have to know on the outside and can make a difference with is to not accept the divide, not accept the dehumanization of people that have come to prison because of a violent offense. because people change, because there's reasons why that happened, and because anybody that's running a prison knows that they depend on the people that we call the long-termers to be able to help other people in the prison, to be able to essentially manage the prison. And so I think that we don't have time to have a lot of discussion about that, but because it's such a basic part of what's happening right now in the COVID situation, where the people that are running prisons and running jails are saying, oh, well, we will release the people with non-violent offenses. That's who we'll release. And the people who are actually in prison for the violent crimes often are the people who have grown, and it's partly because of the time that they are forced to serve, and they've grown older. And it's those very people who are the most vulnerable to COVID. The recidivism data is the least likely to come back of anybody. People who have been convicted of murder are the least likely to ever come back to prison. And they're the older people frequently, and they're the people who are being defined by the press and by the way that prison administrators talk about them. Oh, not the people that have committed violent crimes. And it takes us back to when young people were the super predators in the 1990s, and that played a major role. The media, the academic institution, all played a major role in discarding an entire group of young people. And that's what's happening now in the way that the COVID virus is being defined as what do we do about it? So I wanted to introduce that issue of people with violent crimes and say that we have to we have to change the narrative and we have to fight it. And it's not just in the broader society, it's actually within our movement as well. In terms of solidarity, it's a critical issue. We never could have done what we did at Bedford without people from the outside helping. And I think if you look at what's happening now, to tell a story of what's just happened today and yesterday, my colleague and major person that's my friend and colleague that I came to Columbia with and work with every day, we share an office, Cheryl Wilkins, she just described to me how today a number of people, Yolanda and Sharon White and Rusty and Roz and Keith took to Bedford 4,000 masks, 625 boxes of tea with 100 tea bags in each so that people can have something hot when they don't feel well. 1,240 creamers so that each woman could have 2. Power bars, 6 in number, Mother's Day cards. And for the officers there, they got coffee and large creamers and cookies. And yesterday they took an amount to Taconic, 2,000 masks, 125 coffees, 125 tea, 20,000 packets of sugar. This is solidarity. This is solidarity from the outside. It's solidarity from people that were in prison. It's solidarity that makes a difference. It's about breaking down that distance between people. RAP has been organizing with Parole Steering Committee car gatherings and virtual press conferences at Fishkill, Sing Sing, Edgecombe, and Queensboro, Bedford Hills, and in Chicago at Cook County Jail and Statesville, educating legislators, educating the media, making demands for release, making demands for healthcare. The National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women have women throughout the states supporting each other and how to do clemency campaigns. There's specific people that you'll talk about, I think, Mariame, but also in New Orleans, we did a national prayer session for Mama Glow, the oldest woman in the prisons in Louisiana, was hospitalized for COVID. And there's been a national attempt to get her a pardon. So I think that the connection between the outside and the inside, it's an endless numbers of things that can be done. And I think it's urgent right now with COVID, but it's always been true.
Thank you, Kathy. Please jump in, everybody else. Respond or add your part.
Kathy, thank you so much. Thank you. Oh man. So I'm gonna go back to the violent versus non-violent offender thing. So we all know nationally and locally, it's the violent offenders that are the least likely to return to prison. We know this. It is the non-violent offenders that are the most likely to return to the prison, right? And when that happens, it's because people are already struggling oftentimes with addiction and mental wellness issues on top of poverty and everything else, right? So they're having this struggles and people get caught up in a system designed for them to get caught up and come back to the prison. And we see them like again and again and again, right? And the relationships that we have with them in the prison are are like complex, but they're there too, right? They're a part of our communities. But this is what I want to say, because it's very easy to throw violent offenders under the bus, and I'm not trying to throw anybody else under the bus. When we look at the people that keep coming and going out of prison, what we do is we say they keep coming and going. We're not saying that maybe the treatment models that we're using are fucked up and they don't work, right? Maybe it's time to find something new. Maybe it's time to build affordable housing. Maybe it's time to create new models of mental wellness and substance abuse or addiction treatment or whatever we're calling it, right? But we're putting the onus solely on the people that keep coming back to prison because they keep coming back to prison. We're not saying that they are being failed to, right? And so we're looking at them as they just can't get their shit together. And the easy thing to say is they gotta be ready, right? And it shouldn't take, this goes along with the whole prison saved my life thing, right? Because I can say that too. It's the community that I had in the prison. You were talking about this earlier, Kathy. I was a mess when I got to the prison. I was broken in every single way. I was almost 6 months pregnant and I got beat up and raped and my baby was stillborn right before I got locked up, right? Just a couple of months before I got locked up. I was broken and my body was broken, my mind was broken, my heart was broken, my spirit was broken. And the thing that helped me put myself back together was the people that I was locked up with. The jail didn't give me that. The prison didn't give me that. I just got thrown in there with a bunch of women who had been through all of the same stuff I'd been through. And we would sit up and we would play pinochle and bid and talk and laugh and cry and live. And I learned how to do that there. But that was from the women. That ain't some shit the jail gave me. I took it, you know. A part of resistance is when we educate ourselves and each other and we ascribe meanings to them. Right? So it'll be like one piece of poem and it might be disconnected to everything else, you know, but it would be like one piece of poem or one line from a paragraph that we give meaning to, right? It is, I've lost my train of thought. I've got so much going on. It's what COVID has done, I think, is shown everything to everybody in a way that's like, it cannot be denied anymore. Well, yes, it can, because people are still gonna be like, it's not really that bad, but it should, you know, for the most part, it's undeniable for even for people who didn't want to see it, you know, it should be undeniable. And I just think we talk about like, when we first started hearing about COVID and people were like, it's gonna go for people with pre-existing conditions, or it's gonna hit the hardest, right? And so the pre-existing conditions come from the pre-existing conditions of racism, right? And so we already know poverty, all those things, all those pre-existing conditions gave us pre-existing conditions to hit us harder with, right? And I think it's so urgent that, well, everything everyone has already said. It's time to really truly look past this violent versus nonviolent thing, because when we got to stop saying offender, period, because that's not all a person is. And when you keep someone locked up forever, you're saying that that's all someone is and that's all that they can ever be. And that's just not true. Right, that's just not true, and we know that because where is anybody who is the same exact person now that they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? It's just not true. And also there's this notion of, because people do grow and change, right? But when we talk about people in prison, we seem to be saying that there was already some sort of inherent fundamental flaw with them that took them to the prison, versus being swept up into some shit that they didn't really have any control over. We talk a lot about like the choice, you know, that everybody made to go to prison. And nobody really, actually, there are some people who have chosen to go back to prison because, for real talk, I'm talking about short timers. I know some who have come and gone out of the prison because how can I say this? I have friends that have come and gone out to prison for the whole 20 years that I was locked up, right? They've been there 8, 10, 12 times. I love them just as much as I love the women that were there with me the whole time. But there's also this other thing that happens, right? Because I'm tired of seeing you come in and out the joint, right? I'm mad because, one, honestly, I want to go home because this is what it's a manufactured enmity, right? Because I should not be mad at the person. I should be mad at the system that did this. But when you're concentrated like that, sometimes it can be like hard to look bigger. You just have on like this tunnel vision. Like, why does this motherfucker keep coming back? And so you sit down and you build a relationship. This is what's going on. So there are people that will come back to prison because it's hard out here. And people come to prison and are like, I can get mental health care here. There are people that are like, I have felt this myself. When one of my girls has come back to the joint for the 4th or 5th time, and I didn't hear from her while she was gone. So when she comes back to the prison, I'm like, fuck, I'm mad as hell because she's back, but I'm also like, at least I know where she is. You know, at least I know she's safe. And how fucked up is that? Right? There are people who have family members that keep running in and out of prison. And I have literally heard people say, I've said it myself, at least when they get locked up, at least we know where they are, at least we know they're safe. That's not what it's supposed to be. We're supposed to already have that. We're not supposed to have to wind up in the prison to get any kind of fake ass drug treatment or whatever it is. We're supposed to already have this. You know what I'm saying? And this is the lack of resources that existed out here before that brought us to prison is the same thing that keeps bringing people back to prison. You know, and we need to really be looking at all of that when we're talking about violent versus not. It's not that narrow. I feel like I'm rambling.
It's okay. Thank you, Monica, so much. So what I want to do is, just in the interest of we only have a few more minutes to go, I want to definitely make sure I put that call to action so people can continue to do that. So I want to just give us all a chance for you all to say a few words before I close up with the calls to action. So Laura, you want to kick us off with thoughts, anything that's coming through your mind? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Monica. I mean, I think one piece is everything that we're doing needs to be led by currently and formerly incarcerated people. The way that Kathy kicked off this section is like exactly point of that. The correction of, yes, it's destroying relationships, but it's also destroying people. And like that, it's that analysis is the reason why this work needs to be everyone who's working on the outside doing solidarity work. Like solidarity is built in care, it's built in relationships, and you have to actually be accountable to a person and to a community of people. So I think I want to lift that up in part because I think I've been in a lot of different calls with trying to work with people who are moving, especially through southern states and in areas where there are differently like layers of organizing happening, and folks that are wanting to kind of go whole hog on like, I think that we should do this, or like lawyers who want to like advocate for like, I think we should get a like class action thing through that goes this. But at the moment when I ask them, like, yo, did you talk to anyone who's locked up? Do you know the history of coercive testing in prisons and why like just a blanket order for testing might not be something that folks want, or that they may have a more complicated picture and set of demands going forward? The answer is no, I haven't talked to anyone. And like, that is unacceptable. That cannot be happening in this moment. And I feel like it moves alongside for me of the point that Kathy jumped off for us, that Monica underlined for us, that like any of these sort of ways, nonviolent, violent, like all of these sort of schisms that are put forward, separating inside from outside, like treating prisons as if that we do not, I mean, my friend, one of my friends in New Orleans who talks about like Orleans Parish Prison, or like New Orleans was the prison, Orleans Parish Prison was a timeout, but like anything that in any way is trafficking in the logics of the prison system are things that we have to fight. That means that we fight lawyering that is not social change lawyering, following the leadership of incarcerated people. We fight any sort of carve outs and schisms that are being put. And for those of us who are working in solidarity, we have hard conversations with people. We sit down and talk with them and we're like, no, the demand is no carve outs. That is the demand. We don't have anything else that we should be saying. And we work with people until they can say in their own words why healthcare is right. People are at the center. Our family members are dying. That is the analysis. And it's work that we do by having conversations, by being in relationships, and by following the leadership of people who are locked up.
Thank you so much, Laura. Toussaint, do you want to take us with your final thoughts?
Yeah, there's so much to add to what's been said, but I just want to say a couple quick things. In terms of demonstrating solidarity, one of the most interesting examples that I came across just in my conversation with former prisoner organizers and some of the archival research that I've done is there was a prison rebellion in Illinois in 1978, and one of the first things that prisoners and their outside supporters did is they organized one of these car caravans. And it's one of the first times that I've heard about these taking place, but it was a 2-hour trip from Chicago all the way down to Pontiac, Illinois. They stopped in Dwight first, and then they went to Pontiac. And they did it not necessarily because they thought it was going to get a lot of media attention, but they wanted the guys on the inside to know that there were people on the outside who supported them. And they did it particularly because the prison rebellion that happened, it left 3 guards dead. There was a lockdown that was called for, and there was a concern that the conditions of the lockdown were going to push prisoners to turn on each other, implicate each other in organizing what had been a spontaneous outburst of frustration, and that it was necessary as an organizing tactic to have this demonstration of outside support. And it was successful in that it really helped keep a lot of the prisoners together, maintain a sense of solidarity through what ended up being a months-long period of lockdown. And the same thing came up just recently. Kathy mentioned the caravan that happened, that caravans that have been happening. One of them outside of the Cook County Jail in Chicago. And one of the things that I think has really been striking to note is that caravan happened at the same time that there were hunger strikes taking place in the jail, that the jail was one of the nation's leading hotspots for COVID infections. And there were active organizing efforts by detainees in the jail to push back against the guards, to demand improvements in conditions. And one of the things that in court, one of the prison administrators even revealed that there were prisoners who said when they heard about that caravan taking place, not only did they put signs up on the windows, some of us might have seen them where they said, help us, we matter, that sort of thing. But they also told some of the guards that we have to do stuff inside because there are people who are outside who care about us. And I think it's the kind of an indication of how much solidarity needs to be oriented towards not just thinking about what we can do as a way to demonstrate solidarity, either for ourselves or for the wider public and bring in public attention, but also acting as if the actions that people are taking on the inside matter as well. And that part of our solidarity is in support of the work that folks are having, work that folks are doing inside. So kind of exactly in line with what folks have already said, but that even when we look at some of this kind of history of prison organizing, that kind of demonstration of solidarity can be key in terms of really bolstering a sense of solidarity inside and the capacity that folks can feel in terms of being able to hold on or to stick with things. And then lastly, real quick, I've heard people kind of quote this recent Arundhati Roy piece about like the pandemic is a portal, right? But oftentimes we leave out the fact that she also says that it's only a portal if we fight for it. And I think the danger, and we've already sort of started to see this, is if we don't fight for it, the pandemic accelerates all the bad stuff. I'm gonna try not to cuss. All the bad stuff that we see in society that we were already aware of and concerned about, if we don't fight, all of that is going to not just continue, but get even worse. And I think the thing that we need to do is take advantage of some of the opportunities that do exist, because I think there's a real chance to push forward demand for decarceration in this moment. But I think we also have to be aware of the fact that, we have to really take advantage of building that portal for ourselves and pushing our way through, and do it in a way where we don't simply accelerate some of what folks have already spoken to in terms of not just these divisions between violent and nonviolent, but even ideas around, this pandemic really explodes the utility of prisons in relationship to public health in the first place, in relationship to public safety in the first place. And if we don't take the opportunity to kind of push even harder conversations, then we kind of have the potential to find ourselves being in a situation, a year, 2 years, a decade down the line, facing as difficult, or if not more difficult, circumstances than we're already in.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your thoughts, for your comments. We only have a few minutes left. I want to thank you all for taking the time. We really could have continued this conversation for another 2 hours and probably still would have not scratched all the surface of the things we ought to talk about, but this is such an important beginning. I want to offer people some resources for further reading and study for those who are interested in some of the topics that we've brought forward. Laura, I don't know, do you have a book coming out or something? Is that right? You do.
It's totally true. Yeah, in partnership with the community at Women with a Vision, which is also good to be putting at the center as we're talking about centering the leadership of currently and formerly incarcerated people, lifting up the particular impact around people who use drugs and people who are sex workers in this moment, and that our decriminalization efforts go broadly. So that's the book coming. Awesome.
So keep an eye out for Laura's book. I'll definitely uplift it on Twitter when it's out. Also, Toussaint has a book in the works. There's a book already that on the list that I'll share that Toussaint co-wrote with what's it called? That Toussaint co-wrote with Dan Berger that I'm gonna put up. So can you put the slides up for a minute for me? Thank you. Great. So two of the resources I wanted to commend to you, for those of you who might be interested in some of the stuff that I mentioned from Attica, I put together a few years ago that it's a short primer about Attica. It's a 101, and people can use it if you're a teacher, an organizer, a young person. It's pretty easy to read, and you can get some background information. And there's a whole bunch of suggested readings that are also in there. Please take a look. There's a website called Perilous Chronicle, which is looking at prison uprisings and rebellions starting in 2010 to the present. And they're currently cataloging COVID uprisings as well. So this is a site people can go to and keep up to date about resistance that's not necessarily the resistance that Kathy and Monica and others have kind of already uplifted, that are more outside of our public view, that are the community-based resistances that happen within prisons and jails and detention centers. This is about the documented public forms of resistance that we see out in the community, or that people from the inside let us know about. So that's perilouschronicle.com. I want to then move to the next slide, please, Hope. These are some readings that I want to suggest that people take a look at. There are a million different ones, and it's hard to narrow them down, but I have a few. We can get on the slide for the great. So some books by, as I mentioned, Dan Berger, Toussaint's book, Rethinking the American Prison Movement, which came out in 2018, which I recommend, Captive Nation. The Struggle Within. I like Ronald Berkman's book called Opening the Gates, The Rise of the Prisoners' Movements. Garrett Felber has a new excellent book out that just came out this year called Those Who Know Don't Say. It's about the Nation of Islam and the carceral state and Black freedom movements. And for those of you who might be interested in resistance by incarcerated people, particularly through the courts, there's a lot in that book that uplifts that, because the nation was very much kind of used the master's tools to try to undo the master's house in various kinds of ways. Always George Jackson and Soledad Brother for people who, you know, I think a number one book to read if you just are getting started on these issues and you want to get into it. Joy James, who I really just adore as a thinker, and I really love Imprisoned Intellectuals. And I suggest that. Vicki Law's book, Resistance Behind Bars, is still the only book that I've read about the struggles of incarcerated women to this day. And that came out in 2009, which tells us something. Heather Ann Thompson's kind of beautifully long account, but well-researched historiography about Attica, Blood in the Water. And I have Donald Tibbs here because I like this book about kind of Black power to prison power, which I suggest people take a look at as well. There are other books. There's a book by Cummings that's about kind of California movements of prisoner rights, but I don't like that book mainly because I don't want to go into my critique of the book, but basically he writes a book about radical movements of prison, but really he hates incarcerated people, and more than that, he hates radicals on the outside. So the whole book is basically an expose on that. But if people want some basic things, it's very reactionary, yeah. So I think that, but I do think that it's worth it for just some documentation of what happened in California prisons if folks are interested in that. So I wanted to make those kind of offerings to folks because I do believe it's so important to read. Everybody knows I think that's true. I think it's important to study. I think political education is going to be critical as we move forward, as it always has been. So please take advantage of those things. Lastly, I want to go to some calls to action. As I mentioned to you before, Survived and Punished New York is really, really, really wanting to uplift the demands of our folks on the inside at Bedford who really need conditions to be improved, who really need food and other kinds of means of support to be given to them during this very trying, difficult time. So we want people this week, next week, the week after, to join us in emailing and calling Superintendent Lamanna, the Governor Cuomo, and others. You'll find, keep going on the slides, please, Hope. You will find these calls to action on Twitter and on Facebook and on the other places if you follow Survived and Punished New York. Right now, you can just go to the bit.ly Bedford Hills. You'll find all the graphics, all the scripts, all the text documents there. Please, first thing on Monday, take the time to go ahead and just make these calls right up. There are scripts, there's every kind of thing that we've made available for folks to be able to do these calls. They take a short time. You know, it's not that intimidating if you have a script. So I hope people will follow through and follow up. And we will keep putting out more and more calls to action. And again, keep following us, keep supporting, keep following our comrades, Clemency Coast to Coast, Releasing Aging Prisoners project has been doing a lot of work. RAP has been doing in-person actions. They've been doing virtual actions. They've been really uplifting, particularly the case of people who are immunocompromised, elderly, and who should be getting clemency from Cuomo. If you don't already know, Cuomo's terrible. He's terrible on a lot of fronts, but he's particularly terrible as it relates to criminal punishment issues. Rolled back a very tame bail reform, is, just doing all sorts of things that are really, really problematic. So I know Monica has something that Monica wanted to add before we close up, and I'm going to make sure that you get a chance to jump in on that, Monica. But again, a deep, deep, profound thanks to everybody, all these wonderful people who joined me, who literally did it on such short notice. Like, basically, I asked people to join on Sunday, and they were here already today. And I really appreciate you all, comrades and friends. And I, again, want to just insist to all of us that we do have power. We do have power. We have power in this moment. And as folks are, just pay attention, look around. Folks are fighting. Join in. You really can. We have an ability to be able to shift our conditions. And frankly, at this point in time, you know, I will quote Audre Lorde that despair is a tool of our enemies. It really, really is. It is a tool of our enemies. And we have got to be folks who are prepared to consistently fight. Yes, rest. Yes, take care of ourselves. Yes, do community and collective care. And we have to fight. Toussaint brought that up before. This is a moment for fighting. This is a moment for struggle. So if you're new, join us. If you've been at it for a minute, take a break and come back. We need you. And really excited to continue to build with folks in different ways. So Monica, you please take us. You're going to close us out. You can
unmute. Okay.
You're frozen.
Okay. This is, you can see it. Yeah. So I just moved in this apartment. I got here, then I came to Beyond the Bars with you, Kathy, and then I got back here, and then we were on lockdown, right? And I can say that because like I was actually on lockdown in the prison, and it's kind of hard to hear from people who ain't been there. So this is my Seeds of Solidarity. Sunday is Mother's Day. And so the collective that I organized with, Moms United Against Violence and Incarceration, and all our co-sponsoring that Love and Protect Westside Justice Center is a whole bunch, right? We do a vigil outside Cook County Jail every year for Mother's Day. Asking you all to be there. Those of you who can. If you can't, be there on Facebook and Twitter and whatever it is. If you don't have a garden, or if you have a little plant or whatever it is, cut a picture out of a magazine, whatever it is, and please post it on that day for moms, for parents, and for everyone as a way to memorialize and remember, and also to remember that we're still growing, right? And just Seeds of Solidarity. And the hashtags free our moms, free them all for public health. If there's a specific person like that, to take a picture with a flower or the picture of the flower or whatever it is. I don't care if it's reefer, like plant a bean. I have beans here. I've got basil, dill, rosemary, whatever it is. I'm going to go dig up some dandelions from the front yard and plant them in this little place too, right? I will plant them on the way, and I'm going to plant some seeds out front of Cook County Jail. And Sunday, on actual Mother's Day, we're going to Logan and we're going to Decatur. And so we're asking you for that whole Saturday and Sunday, please, like, tweet the tweets, clemency coast to coast, all of that. West Coast, East Coast, Third Coast. I never heard of that until not too long ago. I thought it was some genius stuff. Like, thank you. And I'm totally lifting this idea from other people that I've organized with prior. Alice Kim is one of them, who I got the whole idea of Seeds of Solidarity from her, from a project that she was doing that I worked with her on. And just please support us. We love you and we need you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Everybody Everybody can follow Moms United Against Violence and Incarceration on Twitter and Facebook. They're doing incredible care work and incredible solidarity work and organizing people who were formerly incarcerated, survivors of violence, currently, and incarcerated folks as well. So please do that and do what Monica asked us, a call to action for Mother's Day. Mother's Day is also, around the corner, Free Black Mamas, and the bailouts are happening right now. Give money to the National Bailout Fund if you can, to support that as well. There's all sorts of things happening. There's just no end to it. I want to end by just uplifting the memory and spirit of Darlene Lulu Say, who died a few days ago. Who was incarcerated at Bedford Hills. Darlene was a poet and a mother, a friend, a person who supported folks on the inside. It was incarcerated for many years, was a survivor, and died of COVID, but also died of Cuomo's neglect and of incarceration. And Darlene's family is raising money for her funeral expenses. Check Survived and Punished sites, our Facebook and our Twitter. We're raising money for those expenses. We also just, again, uplift all the folks who are currently incarcerated and locked up, all our family, all our loved ones, all our comrades. Keep them in mind. We will continue to fight with you, alongside you, and for you. And so thank you all for taking the time. Thank you to Hope and to Eve from BCRW. Thank you to Lauren Schechter, who did our captioning for today. Thank you all. And we'll see you soon again on the either virtual streets or on the actual streets. Thank you all. Take care.